Okay. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first Sustainable Solutions lecture. I hope everybody can hear us from Zoom. Could you give us a thumbs up, Darcy, if you can hear us? Great. Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so first of all, a little introduction. This is the first of the Sustainable Solutions lectures. This is an initiative co-organized by UMass Boston School for the Environment. And we have here Carol Thornberg, the Dean of the School for the Environment, and UMass Amherst School of Earth and Sustainability. And I think we have online Rob De Conto, the director of the school, and Darcy, the executive director of the School of Earth and Sustainability. I'm going to say a few words about this initiative, and then I'm happy to leave a little moment to say a few words to Carol Thornburn and Rob De Conto, if that's okay. So what is the goal of this initiative? We would like to foster dialogue on sustainable solutions and sustainable actions to promote prosperity while protecting the planet. Our lectures will explore the Sustainable Development Goals themes, including the end of poverty, reducing inequalities, improving health and education, improving environmental conditions, and tackling climate change. And our goal of these lectures is to strengthen or spark new collaborations in the field of sustainability between faculty members, students, scholars at our institutions in the UMass system. We hope that other UMass campuses will join this effort. And the last goal is developing an even broader network of collaborations with scholars, experts from universities outside the UMass system, think tanks, national laboratories, government agencies, and international organizations that work to identify and develop solutions to sustainable development challenges, essentially starting a lot of dialogue and possibly collaborations towards sustainable action and becoming a little bit of a contributor to an accelerator at the campus, at the intercampus level. So with this, I would like to transition to presenting our speaker, and then I'm going to leave the floor to Carol to say a few words about the School for the Environment. Our first speaker is Swenja Surminski. I'm very grateful that Swenja was able to be here today. She's a leading international expert on sustainability and insurance, nature-based solutions, climate adaptation, and resilience. Her work spans across research, practice, and policy. She holds multiple roles. She is a professor in practice at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. She's also managing director for climate and sustainability at Marsh McLennan, the world's leading professional services firm in the area of risk, people, and strategy. In 2022, Swenja was appointed by the UK government's Committee on Climate Change and elected chair of the not-for-profit Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. Swenja's current work has a special focus on risk financing, insurance, risk governance, and she's overseeing projects with the geographic scope ranging from the United Kingdom across the EU and China to developing countries. Swenja has published widely on these topics. I'm a big fan of her work. And she's a contributing author to the IPCC and the EU Science for Disaster Risk Management Report, and a lead author of the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment. So we have a wonderful speaker, and I'm looking forward to this talk. And now I'm going to leave the floor to Carol. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am Carol Thornberg. I am the Dean of the School for the Environment here at UMass Boston. And I am delighted to welcome all of you on Zoom, as well as the folks in the room here. As was mentioned, this is a joint effort between UMass Boston and UMass Amherst, and we are also delighted on this campus to hopefully start to form some new partnerships, enhance some existing ones. I am new here to UMass Boston also. I started this summer as Dean of the School for the Environment, so there probably are some ongoing collaborations that just haven't hit my radar yet. So please definitely, if there's ongoing work, I'd love to learn about that as well. And School for the Environment here at UMass Boston, we are Boston's only public research university. We serve the citizens and the people of Boston and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, as well as the greater region. And lots of our work within the school focuses on studies of the environment from natural sciences, social sciences, policy. We also have a Department of Urban Planning and Community Development that does a lot of sustainability work and initiatives, and that is really deeply tied in to the rest of the fabric of our school. We have several institutes and centers and other affiliations that I want to have plenty of time for our speakers, so I won't go into that too much, but I encourage you to take a look at our website and learn more about some of the wonderful resources that we have. So I want to briefly hand this over to Rob to say a few words, and then our guest speaker.
Oh.
Rob DeCanto, if you can hear us. There we go. Great.
Oh, Melissa, thanks. I wasn't sure if I was on the agenda or not. I thought maybe it was another Rob. But thanks very much for the opportunity to just say how thrilled we are at UMass Amherst to be collaborating in this way. We've always seen potential for much stronger ties between the School of the Environment and the School of Earth and Sustainability. And I'm very excited to hear today's talk. I'm aware of our speaker's work, and we'll look forward to more of this.
Okay, well, I'm not quite sure where to look and where to position myself. I think at the moment, nobody can really see me.
It's following the noise.
It's following the noise, so I just need to make more noise. Okay, I'll just keep talking and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we can always adjust.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. It's always a pleasure to visit the East Coast. It doesn't happen very often, but when I'm here, I'm very excited. And yeah, this idea came about. I'm here for a conference tomorrow, and then I reached out to Martha and I'm really glad we could set something up. Well, first of all, many thanks for the kind introduction. It's always nice, it's a nice way of making one feel welcome. I'm going to talk about a couple of interrelated aspects here, and I'm very conscious, these are things that I've been working on basically throughout my career, as an academic, also as a practitioner, and also advising government. So I can get very passionate, and I can also, I really, I'm deeply, sort of committed to these things. So I'm conscious that we also want to have a discussion. So at some point you might just want to rein in, or we'll see how we go. And I guess maybe the last point to say, Martha alluded, and you can see it on the screen, to the different hats I'm wearing here. So take this with a pinch of salt. So there will be some slides, I think, that are kind of more looking at this from a corporate angle. And most of this comes through my research and much of work at the LSU. But the good thing is, although I'm wearing different hats, it is very complementary. And I hasten to say that it all pulls in the same direction. So, I don't have a personality disorder because of the different hats. It's actually really complementary. And so now I just need to know how I move the slide.
It's right there.
Underneath.
Right there.
Okay.
If you want to admit that person.
Oh,
I understand the other.
Trying to see if I can do okay.
Yes.
And do we move or down here? No.
Down there.
Down there. Ah, cool. Okay. Everybody fine? You can all hear me okay, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, so this is like roughly what I have in mind. We'll see how we get on, but so this will be framed in terms of climate adaptation, and I'll say something whether it's resilience or adaptation. We could spend 3 hours discussing that. I don't think that's the idea, but I'll do a little bit something on terminology. I guess then I'll show that I can multitask here. It's going to be not a big surprise for many of you to establish that we have an adaptation gap. So we'll say what that is, but then how are we going to close that, and who is actually supposed to adapt and who's going to pay, and then the limits to adaptation. So that's kind of the rough idea here that I have. Let's see how we get on. So can we get rid of this? No. Okay. I will just behave and not move the mouse. Fine. Okay, so just to kind of bring us all on the same page, I'm a big fan of this diagram from the IPCC, which kind of breaks down of what we actually mean when we talk about climate change risks. And, you know, I guess many of you will be familiar with hazard, vulnerability, exposure as the sort of traditional risk equation. At least you're familiar with it when you come from a risk background. The interesting thing, and this is a big statement at the beginning, I will often use the term climate risk. And I think, you know, that is obviously, you know, there is a risk management angle to this, but at no point should we forget that actually some of these risks have already kind of been realized. And, you know, in many places we experience already climate change. So, you know, we are not talking about this as a distant future challenge, but it's very much, you know, already having an impact. And I guess the kind of notion here is that, you know, we now know what is kind of installed, why, you know, we're sort of moving towards a new normal, and why things are actually going to be quite messy in terms of exactly predicting how our future will look like. So, and this is kind of, you know, kind of takeaway. You know, we could probably spend all time just discussing this slide here. So this kind of sets out what I call the climate adaptation challenge. And I'm conscious I haven't even defined the term. So, you know, we'll come to the definition in a moment. Maybe just to clarify, so here we saw mitigation adaptation actions. So I assume you'll be familiar with this split. So adaptation is how we deal with the impacts of climate change, and mitigation is how we deal with the cause and basically reducing emissions. And then adaptation comes in here. Yeah. So we know that climate adaptation is challenging. It's challenging for different stakeholders, different countries, regardless whether they're rich or poor. Obviously, they have different challenges, but it is a challenge. And the first point to know is these risks are not linear and they're interdependent. And it is actually, you know, it is a challenge for our way of looking at trends and development. So that's kind of a big challenge for people who want to plan ahead. Then I guess, and I can't see actually the rest of the slide because of
You
this.
should be able to minimize that.
Yeah.
There you go. And then change it. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, now I can actually do. Cool. So we are aware, and you know, obviously it's not a new thing to deal with physical climate risk. We always had disasters and we had to deal with that. But we're not keeping up basically with a changing climate. So that's where the adaptation gap comes in. We're basically not doing enough to address risk. In fact, we're actually creating risks, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And this is kind of really that stats here. That's kind of what motivated me to do, you know, a lot of work on resilience. We did some work at the LSE to calculate how much money was spent globally on disaster response and recovery. And then we compared that to how much was actually going into preparedness and risk reduction and adaptation as well. So basically the prevention side and dealing with something afterwards, and surprise, surprise, we have a huge imbalance. And I think this is, you know, this would be a challenge even without climate change. climate change just makes this actually even more unsustainable. So the key is how can we switch and how can we move away from that balance? I mentioned already that we're creating new risks, and we can talk about that. There's also the risk of what I call lock-ins. So, this morning, I was actually discussing this particular issue with energy investors who kind of invest in utility companies or in the sort of, in the power sector. And, they're making decisions every day about where to put stuff and how to plan and how to build things. And even if they kind of invest in a, let's say, green energy future, are they considering physical risk? Some of them do, but most of them don't. So a lot of these decisions about where we put stuff and how we build it are just not done with any acknowledgement of physical risk today or in the future. There's actually, for economists on this call, there's a strong cost-benefit case for adaptation, but it's really difficult to monetize it. We can talk about that. The good thing is, if we do it smartly, adaptation can have lots of environmental, social, economic benefits. But do we actually know where we're going, and what does actually good adaptation look like? And because we don't have targets. I mean, if you ask me, is Boston better adapted than New York City? There's no simple way of establishing that. Or I know, Martha, you're working a lot with local communities. Comparing their level of adaptation, it's not straightforward. And to what level should we actually adapt to? So that's kind of a big challenge in this space at the moment. So just a kind of flavor for the complexity maybe, and for some of these underlying notions, the political economy aspects, there's technical challenges. But also, I think a lot of this has also to do with behavioral science. So it's, you have to look at this from an interdisciplinary background. I should say my background is actually, I'm an economist, but also political scientist. And now I do a lot of work on businesses. So, okay, well, adaptation, and this is the other point, really important. It can come in many disguises, and people use different terms and terminology for it. So, in a very simple way, and I think I'll have a very simple definition here. We can come back to these other ones. So it's action taken to help community ecosystem cope with changing climate conditions. So it's really sort of increasing our ability to not be thrown off course by a changing climate. Yeah. And then you have some nuances here. I won't go into detail from IPCC. There's a strong interlinkage with development, sort of making sure that actually, poverty reduction and, our investments to end hunger and to increase development are not eaten up, well, kind of derailed by a changing climate. That we actually have strategies to cope with these changing climate conditions. And here, for people who are interested, there is kind of like an explainer on this. I'm showing this. Oh, that's not very clever. I wanted to go to this slide. Just to show that depending on who you talk to, and I have to do this all the time when I'm talking to businesses or government or other disciplines, you have to actually be aware that the climate adaptation terminology is sometimes completely meaningless, and you have to fill it with examples. And the easiest way of saying, okay, it can be all of these things that are listed here. If you consider current and future climate impacts and how you adjust your way to manage supply chains or to do your planning policy, adjust it in the face of changing climate. I mean, that's kind of in a nutshell it, that's it. So unfortunately, we have to go back all the way through, sorry. So I don't know if anybody here works then also in this sort of resilient space, because, this is, again, it's a big question. Are we talking adaptation? Are we talking resilience? I don't want to go much into detail. I sometimes use them, interchangeably. I think this is quite helpful. Colleagues at the LSE have sort of settled on adaptation as the process and resilience as the capacity or ability. Might be useful to discuss that. People might have very different views here, but I think in this context, in this talk, I might sometimes actually use the climate resilience terminology. So we can come back to that if people feel that was confusing, or if they have different views actually on this. So, when we say, I mean, we've established this is all about addressing physical risk, and maybe I should have said what these physical risks actually are. I mean, in more simple terms, they are extreme events. So, you know, the usual thing, wildfire, storms, floods. But then they can also be the more sort of gradual changes, and that's where sea level rise comes in, where long-term droughts and water scarcity comes in. So these are kind of the physical risks of climate. So basically, an adaptation strategy, you can develop some, and you'll be pleased to hear the United States has an adaptation strategy. Probably Boston has an adaptation strategy. I don't know if the university has one. Those maybe look into that. So it can come at different levels, and I do a lot of work across levels. I'm working on adaptation guidance for ministries of finance, which is a big project with the US Treasury actually co-chairing it, and it's with 90 countries. And the idea is to show how adaptation also matters to public finance and to ministries of finance, and then to sort of take them through what actually is needed to develop adaptation strategies. So that's an example, but you can have the same conversation with the local community. What do you actually need for an adaptation strategy? And this is just like a kind of standardized framework that has emerged that kind of shows how you actually move through this. And it's obviously also a continuous process, because you can't just say, okay, now we adapted, tick, and we move on. It's a continuous thing, because the climate conditions are changing and you have to revisit, and a lot of other factors are also changing. So it's a really kind of continual, I often call like a dynamic way of addressing these risks. And, I'm not going to go through all these steps here, but, this is kind of helpful when you sit down with someone to actually explain what are the components. And the ability to do this will differ hugely, whether you're talking to people, a local community who've never done any of this, or to a company who's already invested in some risk assessment, or where regulation requires them to do this, or whether you're talking also in a developing country context where they actually don't have any data. So you just get a sense, how this plays out in reality is actually quite different, but the underlying steps, I think, are pretty similar. Okay. And so having a strategy is one thing, but what does it actually mean? What do you then actually do in terms of what does adaptation look and feel like? And here I usually break it down into these sort of 5 different buckets. So, prospective, corrective, preparedness, response, recovery. And, the key point again is doing these with a view of current and future climate. So recovery, in my view, is an adaptation if you just build something back. But if you make it more resilient, if you also consider whether you have to relocate or relocate it, actually, then you're talking about becoming adapted to changing climate. If you just rebuild, that is a recovery exercise, but it doesn't actually make you better prepared going forward. So that's a bit of the kind of line that I take when sort of deciding whether something is actually done with adaptation in mind, whether it's just a pure sort of disaster response. And here you see some examples. And by looking at these examples, you quickly realize adaptation comes in different forms and shapes, but also needs action and guidance and incentives that cut across different sectors. And that is kind of like, sometimes people say, oh, we need like an all of society approach. Well, it sounds a bit grant, but at the end of the day, the adaptation is not done by one single entity. It needs, and it's also usually there's not one single adaptation solution, so you need a mix of these. And this is just a different way of looking at these, I call it sometimes the adaptation toolbox. So this is actually really good to know that we have a lot of tools, and technology is actually making new advances, particularly in this space. We also have a much better understanding of working with nature. Engineering has improved. We know that we could do more in this space. Insurance, will come to that in a minute. And we also start to have better understanding of behavior. So I usually say we really have a good toolbox. We have a good understanding of how we should use it. But, and this is now the adaptation challenge or the gap, we're not doing it. These tools are currently underutilized, underfunded, or being implemented. And in developing countries, and this applies across the world. I mean, there are actually some places, cities, maybe some businesses that actually have invested in that. But by and large, we're not doing well on the adaptation side. And in some, particularly developing countries, then availability, affordability are key challenges. So why do we have this adaptation gap? This kind of connects a little bit to what I said at the beginning, the challenge. So one thing, and this is a reflection on a typical work week that I have. So things that I pick up from the research side, there's evidence on all of this, but also from conversations. So there's this notion it's only relevant in the future. So, we'll wait till we have more information and then we'll care about this. Seen as a cost, not an investment. And I'm not judging whether this is wrong or right or wrong. These are just kind of, observations, lack of understanding. Disincentives at play. My meeting today was a perfect example of, I could give you a long list of reasons why certain markets, certain systems are just not geared towards it. There's just no proper or very little proper incentives for doing, adaptation and resilience, and doing it early at the time when it's most cost effective, and not just kind of retrofitting. So that's kind of like a challenge. Business individuals often think it's a public good. I guess we personally might fall into that trap. I want my government to do certain things, and I expect them to take care of certain risks. A lot of these challenges also have a sort of public good nature. But when you then talk to government, they say, well, we don't have money and we expect others to also do their share. And that's a classic challenge that you have here. Insurance. So this is probably something, maybe we can come back to that and have a long discussion. Insurance can play, or does play, obviously, a huge role in this space, but it can also be seen as, as long as I have insurance, I don't have to worry about this. Which, is the case, either with businesses, with governments, with individuals. But we shouldn't forget the majority, at least on a global scale, the majority of people, business or governments don't actually have insurance. So the key question is, how can we actually design insurance and also sort of make it work so that it supports adaptation and that it kind of works with those at risk to actually not only address or transfer or give them financial compensation, but also make them better adapted. And then this is the last point on this list here. It has a strong inequality element. So if you're interested in social justice or fairness, there's a new term called just adaptation. It's not rocket science to say the most vulnerable in our society are also going to usually most badly impacted by physical risks. Yeah. So you see this playing out when you have an extreme event, a hurricane, or so there's a danger that, that inequality element will actually even get worse. And, it's a horrible term, but physical risk ghettos. I've done work in the UK where I looked, I think I have a slide at the end, but where we looked at where low-income housing is being put. And obviously, we have some planning policies and guidance, and it prevents them from putting them at high risk right now. But when you consider that risk changes, and then you have also sort of the dynamic shift of these boundaries between what's currently a high risk area or what's currently a low risk area, which might be in 20 years' time and moved into becoming a high risk area, then you suddenly see actually that a lot of these low income housing projects are quite likely going to face significant challenges. And, they're usually can't move away, or they also can't really access or pay for insurance. So this inequality element is really important to keep in mind. And I think sometimes the whole adaptation challenge is also a huge social policy challenge. And that was actually the conclusion of what was called a stress test that the Bank of England, they were the first central bank who kind of did a financial stress test on climate and physical risks of a country. Their conclusion was the biggest challenge is going to be on the social side, the social policy side, and the inequality that this creates. And this is just for the UK. I mean, developing countries, you can imagine it's even worse. So just briefly, how can we close the gap? And I talked already about this risk equation. So, the starting point as always is understanding current and future risk. And this is an area where I think we've come a long way, and there are a massive amount of tools and new databases and things out there that you can use. And it's just an illustration of something that I was involved in. The key is we have to think through not just in terms of direct risk. So, if it doesn't hit your community, you're okay. Well, it might hit your community indirectly because you might depend on something, as shown here, and you might not see that, or you might not have a direct way of influencing the resilience of your power infrastructure or of your transportation network. So failure of critical infrastructure, that is really a big challenge. And I know this is also a key challenge here in the US. So risks are global, local, and interdependent. Just some stats. And I think the way I'm using this is really also to show that, there is a trend. Obviously, it matters where we're heading in terms of global warming. But we have to take all these numbers with a pinch of salt because, these are global figures. And there are huge differences depending which country you're at. So, global figures, yes, might be informative for some, but it really becomes interesting when you look at how this plays out at a country level and then locally. So, I think this is kind of the point I made earlier that, it can then sort of spread impacts across socioeconomic systems. And here you have some numbers in the population at risk. And, you look at global averages, but then you see how this kind of plays out here across different countries. I mean, I should just reiterate that point. So the risk information part is really important. It sort of should underpin all of that. And I think we really have good data. There is a big challenge around tipping points. I don't know if anybody works on analyzing risk because, the big concern is that our tools are really not capturing the real magnitude of changes in place. So, for example, these tipping points, some really dramatic shifts, melting of Antarctic iceland. I mean, these are examples. We can't rule out that they will happen. There is, it's really difficult to put probability numbers on them. The consequences would be catastrophic. So, you know, you can't really expect people to start planning for it, but we should at least be aware that we can't rule them out. And you could argue that alone should actually be, you know, enough information to then make sure that we're not hitting these tipping points. But coming back to the sort of risk management adaptation side, so, you know, I mean, these are kind of like some steps that I feel, you know, that they kind of, I said there's no simple solution. These are kind of like the components that I think could move us forward and could help to address the adaptation gap. And, you know, you see that this kind of cuts across different aspects. But I think if you look, for example, at flood risk here in the US, you will see a lot of these things, you know, there are significant issues with all four of them. So I'm not going to go into detail. But, you know, the other point is here, this whole of society approach, because again, that this is not something that you can just leave to government or leave to you know, insurance or leave to a particular sector. Adaptation spreads across. And then, so it's multi-sectoral. The other thing is, in order to adapt, you also need to really have a good understanding of your capacity to adapt. And I assume, Martha, you're doing a lot of work with communities, and so have I. We're part of what's called a Flood Resilience Alliance with all these NGOs here. And we've developed this framework. It's based on the 5 capitals of resilience. And it really it's a tool that allows communities in the global south, but also here you see a community in England, and we've done it in Germany, to do a bit of a stock take, like how resilient are we actually today, and where are our gaps? And the key is that it's not just a question of how much money do we have, or do we have a flood barrier. No, it also looks at, you know, how well set up is our natural environment, and are we actually utilizing nature, and is nature healthy to help us protect against it? Human capital in terms of, you know, capabilities and skills and risk awareness, and social capital in terms of, you know, do we have the right institutions, structures to actually deal with it? And I think that's quite useful. So to bring home that you have to also think through why a risk has these kind of impacts in one place and might have different impacts in another place. I mean, that's basically what's behind it. And very quickly, and maybe we can skip this, but there is some literature, or there is actually quite a lot of literature on the strong economic case for adaptation. And here you see some results for different adaptation tools. You know, this usual $1 invested saves you X dollars in terms of usually of losses or avoided losses. But the challenge is, and you should actually add to this also like co-benefits, and, you know, it's not just losses avoided, you can have co-benefits, and that's something that I worked on, but I'm not going to dwell on it. But the challenge is to actually take that understanding and then build a strong business case, because these benefits might accrue over a long time horizon. But you need to make like an investment now, and you need to adjust your strategy and your plan now. That's where, you know, often the first barrier comes up, and where businesses and also governments are really struggling. So we've surveyed at the LSE, we surveyed some businesses to understand where they are in their understanding of risks, and then also identifying and implementing solutions. And you know, it is kind of, it's a bit of a snapshot. We've just repeated this now in the corporate sector with Marsh McLennan, and I can share some results, maybe distribute them later. But the interesting thing is that, you know, there is still, I mean, you know, they seem they're very fine. Okay, good for them. But I think here you have concerns, but they haven't assessed it. They've started doing something. They do it periodically. Okay. And here is like that small group that they do regular assessments, and then they do also take action and response. And that's kind of where I think, where in my view, that's where the adaptation kicks in. So, you know, that's kind of a long way to go. I mean, it's not bad if you already start with this, but I often come across also businesses as well as governments who think they've done the risk assessment, that's kind of the job done. Well, I say, well, that should be the first step, and what you then do with it is the key part. But, and this brings us a little bit also to the insurance discussion. So often people I deal with, you know, they get very sort of excited and they say, oh yeah, this is a real new issue and we need to find new ways. And, you know, I won't stop their excitement. Maybe with the one caveat, it's not a new issue. And, you know, there is a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of technical evidence out there. It's just that we haven't really managed to mainstream it and integrate it. And at this point, I usually ask people to guess the date of this publication. I don't know how we can do this with the audience on the screen, but anybody here want to make a guess when that report was published? So if you can't read it, Swiss Re is the second largest reinsurance company in the world, and they published this: climate change in the insurance industry is still a critical issue. 2000. Okay, we have one early 2000. No, it was earlier.
70s. 50s.
Okay, 70s is not that, it's not this one, but the first ever publication from a reinsurance company was on the 70s, from Munich Re. This particular one is from 1995. Okay, but the clue is still a critical issue. And yeah, so tomorrow I'm at an event, insurance companies, and they wanted me to moderate a session. Can insurance play a role in creating a more resilient society? Question mark. I said, honestly, if you want to keep that question, then I'm not going to come. We need to change it. It's like, how can the sector help? I mean, like, you get the point here. Yeah? So anyway, so this is just a reminder that, you know, it's not a new topic. There are solutions out there, but the longer we wait, the harder and the more expensive it will get. I mean, that's like the old logic. So just briefly before I sort of open this up, how can we move from what I call from assessment to then action? And, you know, this is kind of what I'm spending a lot of my time on, to kind of start with making sure people understand that these risks are interconnected and interdependent, and that you also have to keep in mind, if you're a business, what happens to your employees. There's actually a big push here in the US, an initiative that looks at extreme heat risk and the duty of care that businesses have for their employees. You know, it just shows you how this kind of all comes back from different angles, from investors, you know, their understanding of how assets are performing, really important. So that's kind of one thing. And then I think this is quite nice. So you have different levers, enablers, you know, and then you start with the risk, you know, all of these kind of things make a business in this case, you know, more able to deal with it. And then, you know, there are different approaches that they can take. And all of these are happening, but it's just not widespread. And you only have a few pioneers. And sometimes it's shocking how little companies actually know about their supply chains. And how, I mean, you've seen this here after the hurricanes, how vulnerable our supply chains are. And often really critical aspects. I mean, was it the sand quartz facility? You know, really important for microchip production.
IV fluids.
Yeah. So, you know, but, you know, I think that is starting to change, obviously, usually after the event. And then it's kind of, are we engaging all who make the relevant decisions? And I call this like the window of opportunity to make a decision that turns out to create a more adapted outcome, or a kind of business as usual thing. And you can see already there are lots of ways, lots of opportunities, you know, sort of the developer, architects, also in terms of planning policies and building codes. You know, but the question comes down to who has the right incentives to actually do this. At the moment, the answer is, you know, the incentives are not strong enough, and we just carry on business as usual. there are exceptions, and we can talk also about how this plays out here in the US in terms of, building property development and so on. But it just illustrates that there's a chain of interest, also economic interest involved in this. And then the last point is around insurance. And I know that's a big discussion also here in the US. Is there, is insurance going to be less available, or is it going to be sort of, in some areas it is already becoming unaffordable or less available. But, this kind of compares differently across countries. And usually when you hear the term protection gap, it's kind of, it's broken down in terms of the total economic losses compared to what is insured. And that gives you then the number. So, I mean, there's no place that has 100% insurance penetration, but this gives you an idea. So the more...
Does China say 90?
Sorry?
Does China say 90?
China says 90. So you only have insured, what is it? It's in US billions, 9.1 billion of the losses, but the total was 95. So this captures how much of these losses are then actually carried by the insurance industry. And the concern is that these protection gaps will increase if we do not address the underlying risk, or if insurers also not start changing their business model towards a more adaptation-focused approach. And this is kind of what I'm trying to do within the sector. And we wrote this report here with a vision of, how can we actually, make insurance work for adaptation? And you have some examples here. One is also community-based catastrophe insurance that links insurance and adaptation. There are different things that after an event, you build something back better or more resilient. I mean, there is a degree of innovation, but it's not mainstream and it's not widespread enough. And, learning from events, it's not the ideal way of doing it, but, that's when there's a short window of opportunity after an event. So very shortly, just to close it, we talk a lot about adaptation as sort of an economic issue or policy issue. I mentioned it has a social element here, disproportionately affect poorer, marginalized communities. But we also need to be very clear that some regions are already starting to reach what we call adaptation limits. So this notion of some areas where we have to relocate, and relocation is already happening in some areas. So you could argue maybe relocation is part of adaptation, but we need to take into account, how we would actually manage this. And I did this with a colleague from New Zealand, where we looked at, how could one actually come up with a sort of funding mechanisms to actually enable countries to be prepared once they actually have to relocate certain communities. And in some countries, it's already happening. This is the paper I mentioned in terms of, avoiding these risk ghettos, just a reference here. And then the last thing here is, the adaptation limits. We're not going to be able to adapt to every type of climate. So, there's a clear motivation to keep climate change limited. And we already have a very live discussion about compensating those communities who've already experienced losses. And this is in the context of loss and damage. And the notion that, particularly in the global south, they haven't really caused the problem. They're now experiencing it. So is there a degree of having global mechanisms to help them compensate that? And that was really a very quick run through some of the issues I'm exploring. And I hope we have some discussions. I alluded to some aspects where I know these things are quite live and hot topics. But given that you're from very different disciplines, I'm not quite sure how we're actually going to do this. So shall I stop share?
And maybe we can leave open the chat. You can click on the chat and we can read the questions. If you want, you can, if you scroll up, you can read the questions. If there are questions, and answer them. And then we can just open the floor in the room. What do you think?
I think these are more administrative questions.
I have
Okay.
a question.
Okay, I mean, I don't know if I could see any sort of hand.
I think if people just come off mute, if they wanna raise their hand or just speak, or in the room. If you have a comment.
That's it.
I know the chancellor's on, so they want to recognize, UMass
Oh.
Boston Chancellor.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Yes, we should recognize our Chancellor of UMass Boston, Marcelo Orozco, if you want to say a few words, Chancellor.
Thank you. What a wonderful, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. What a wonderful presentation. I wish I could be there, but I'm in my office. Thank you so much. I've learned a great deal. This is part of our endeavor. Sorry, I have a little Ram Ramanathan, my colleague at Scripps, who discovered the CFCs 50 years ago and has been at the forefront of correcting the IPCC at every turn, showing that their models have
Very
been
good.
wrong. Showing that their models have been wrong. We've gathered mayors and governors because we completely concur that this is all moving very, very rapidly into a multiplicity of adaptive models that will stretch human adaptation. And as we've heard today, Carol Ardeen was there when we've heard Darwin's prophetic words that it's not the strongest or the smartest that survive, but the most able to change, to adapt. It's really the work of mayors and governors from around the world, especially the most vulnerable places on Earth, that will take the fight against climate change now and moving forward. So we're planning a series of summits around the world, from the Amazon to the South Seas, from Africa to Europe. And the idea is, how do we bring best practices from the mayors and governors at the forefront of these new challenges to prepare for extraordinarily devastating, wicked climate shocks. Their ethical implications are stunning. Countries that have the least implication in creating the most heat-trapping particles are the ones that are most impacted. So, as you suggested, the nut to crack here is going to be the financial. 80% of the monies go to mitigation, probably more. I don't know if I heard your figures correctly, but I think it's up to 90% of the resources go to mitigation. Tiny amount is going to adaptation and societal transformation. And the die is cast. While mitigation is fundamental, this is one of the mistakes, I think, strategic the IPCC made, not to talk about adaptation. And now it has to be an all hands on deck. And the question of the financing of this is just fundamental. So thank you for your tremendous presentation. And I wish I could meet you personally. You're located in London?
Yes, I'm based in London, and I work with Nick Stern.
Oh, yes.
He's the chair of the Grantham Research Institute. So yeah.
Beautiful. We brought the mayor of London to
Okay.
to Rome, and he did a great job, I thought. He was very nervous meeting the Pope. I told him to relax.
Well, he's a Muslim, so I don't know why he was nervous to me.
He brought him tea from London. The Pope said, "I drink mate." He's hard.
Yeah.
He drinks mate. He doesn't drink tea, but he was very happy with the tea. Anyway, brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you, Carol, and thank you for the team for, this is so important. This is the most important issue facing the world. If we don't get in front of this, there's nothing as significant. So thank you. And thank you for letting me be a part of it. I have to run to another meeting. I'm sorry.
Go. Well, thank you. Thank you for your work. And maybe just to reiterate, I think from a sort of university and research point of view, I think there's also quite a lot that we can take away, like how effective have we been in communicating, the knowledge and, what we have, and how accessible have we actually made it, and how are we engaged in it. At my institute, we're very impact focused, but usually the academic system doesn't necessarily reward you for that, because you actually have to do academic research and publish in the right journal. So finding a good way of combining the two is for some disciplines actually quite challenging. There was a hand and then it disappeared.
Yes. Hi. This is a really interesting presentation, and thank you for sharing with this. So I have just one question. Since I work in the same realm within insurance, so I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the role of the insurance companies playing in the future of climate adaptation, and how can they help this to bridge this adaptation gap, especially in the underinsured communities?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I think insurance, the insurance business model is at the moment is not really geared towards the risk reduction and adaptation and longer term, adjustment. So it's really geared towards the next 12 months, and they assess the risk and you pay for it and you're covered basically for the next 12 months. There are now efforts, and some particular mutual insurance companies are starting to actually build in, these sort of adaptive elements. They share more information with clients. They give clients advice on what to do, what to avoid. Some actually have some conditions. So, they wouldn't insure you if you haven't done X, Y, and Z. So, there are examples of that emerging, but in my mind, and I think there was a slide with this kind of vision, I usually say, look, my vision is that actually the insurance industry becomes one of the main drivers and, catalysts for adaptation, rather than just kind of a risk financing institution. It's challenging, but that was also the reason why I took up this job with Marsh McLennan, because that gives me access to pretty much all the insurers. And some of them are starting to embrace it, but it's a long journey, I think.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Marta. Svenja, that was really wonderful and a great learning experience for me. And I share the chancellor's sentiment. I wish I could have been there, but thank you for the opportunity to be on Zoom. So, it would have been fun to tell the chancellor that I'm partly responsible for some of those wrong IPCC models. And as some of you might know, I'm one of the folks that have been advocating for talking about some of the potential outcomes that are way outside of the so-called likely range of possibilities. And we could talk all about that for a whole afternoon, but one thing that is changing in my world from the science side is discussions about advocacy for geoengineering. And, you know, geoengineering projects that would come at enormous expense, beyond the hundreds of billions of dollars sort of estimates that have been put on the table for example, protecting San Francisco and Houston and Manhattan. And I'm just wondering what, and there's no specific question here, but really just to open up a conversation about this, because I'd love to hear your take on what you're hearing in your circles from a global economic perspective and the private sector's advocacy for this, and what people are talking about in terms of geoengineering.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and it's also a topic that, I don't know, people get very nervous when they talk about, I think, because I mean, you know, we're kind of dealing with some of these are really large scale. It's, you know, we haven't tested it. You know, the consequences could be very, very scary. I mean, the first point is we're already doing geoengineering. So, you know, there is already this, and people get very surprised when I say that. I mean, we're already manipulating clouds, and we're sending planes into the air, and then we can kind of decide where water will fall. And that is happening. And sometimes it goes wrong, and you have a lot of rain falling. So that is already the reality. And I think the more we move towards, you know, extreme risk, the more open-minded society will become to actually go down some more extreme routes, which then creates, you know, just a new set of risks. I mean, when I talk about geoengineering to insurers, they say, well, don't come to us. I mean, you know, this is kind of, but I mean, they're saying that now. I mean, I think once we're sort of hitting this and once the prototypes are developed, I mean, I think it's probably something that we will require a lot of governance, but I don't think, you know, I certainly foresee that there will be more geoengineering. The danger is that the reliance on it will then become a disincentive to do the other stuff that we need to do. So, you know, we hope that we will find the one technical solution to it all, and we can happily continue with fossil fuels. I mean, you know, that would just be the biggest folly that we could do.
Yeah, I have kind of like one question out of several questions. So I'm interested in this issue of, and the way you frame it as physical risk. And I'm wondering if broadening it to emotional risk, historical trauma risk, if broadening that set of thinking around this, you would include health insurance as part of the insurance, and maybe you already are thinking of them, but I didn't see it. And then if you broaden it in that way, would you be able to, and you said near the end here, maybe in response to Marcelo, that or Marcelo said this about the cultural change, right? There has to be like this really drastic change in culture. And so we've seen some examples of things like in Ecuador, and they have Buen Vivir, like the idea that it's not just about adapting for, you know, the next hurricane that comes, but it's like shifting so that we all have a good life, and it's focused on, you know, all this inequality that you also mentioned. So I'm wondering about indigenous, traditional ecological knowledge in indigenous and Afro-Mexicano communities, which I'm working now currently, but is there some way to sort of broaden it to get beyond and then maybe bring more folks in, and that people feel like they're part of this too, like their knowledge is, you know, important and contributing to, you know, adapting and saving the planet.
Yeah, I mean, these are hugely important aspects. And I take your point that the moment we're framing it as physical risk, it kind of alludes to, you know, this is just stuff that hits you with physical essence and you can destroy something. And out of my own experience, working also with, you know, with people who've been impacted by floods or by other extreme events, and it's the mental challenges, the stress, the loss of, intangible things. I mean, these are really the human toll, if you like. So that it's a really important point. I think there are quite a few initiatives in this space, and the slide I showed you was this, what we call Flood Resilience Alliance, with all these NGOs.
Yeah, I like that.
And the view, because they're looking at these 5 capitals of resilience, and they're trying to take into account like who in our community actually has also knowledge and has tools. And one partner there was Plan International. They bring in perspective from young people, from children, and trying to integrate them into this. And because the way you put it is absolutely right. This should not just be about, will I be better prepared for the next hurricane? Now, this is about, how's my livelihood? How's my life trajectory? Do I have a future? And I think that, the framing is really important. I completely take that, yeah.
I was wondering on your opinion on the role that the government has played in putting people in places that are at risk by subsidizing insurance. So like this has happened in Florida, where insurance is pretty cheap because it's subsidized, but you're actually enabling people to move to places that are at high risk that they're not fully aware of, or even because the data is not there and they're like, oh, insurance is cheap, so maybe my risk is low, but it's actually partly paid for the government to put people in those situations.
It's a really good point, and it's true. I mean, we think that insurance could be a good sort of risk signal, because it sort of tells you if there is a risk, if that risk gets worse, and you should take that signal into account, and you should do something about it. So the question is, at the moment, in many countries, or most cities, including here, insurance doesn't play that risk signal role. It's, in some cases, it has to be made cheaper, because otherwise it would be unaffordable already. So that removes also this signal, because it's subsidized. Or there is also, not, and this is the point I make, that the insurers are also not really engaging with those at risk to then take into account all these efforts that the business or a community might make, and that gets recognized in insurance. So you should also then give them credit, and there should be an incentive to do that. So this is something I'm trying to navigate, and this vision that I've pointed out there, that's kind of how I think things should look like in the future, but they don't do look like. The problem is with insurance, the moment it starts getting expensive or it becomes not available in places where people have relied on insurance, governments will step in and will come in and help. And I can understand that. I'm not saying they shouldn't do it, but they should do that with a view, okay, we're doing that, but at the same time, we're using it to create more resilience and make the place better adapted.
Isn't it on this point, isn't it like that in many poor communities, nobody ever has insurance? So the government always has to come in. Like in Mexico right now, when all the hurricanes, the Acapulco came, left, they came back, John. And the communities are just receiving government help. There is no insurance.
Actually, Mexico is a country, they've tried, and they have actually quite, effective insurance structures for farmers, but also the government itself has an insurance mechanism. If something happens, that they have funds to tap into to then pay for the recovery and resilience. That only works after an event, not before. So again, you have this mechanism, it's great, but does it give you an incentive to be better prepared to adapt? Would have to design it in a way, and that's kind of what we're trying to do, to make sure we can use these financial mechanisms actually to push adaptation.
Maybe we are about to wrap up, but I wanted to share a couple of considerations. This financing problem is very large, and it seems that the financing for adaptation is related also to financing for human capital, meaning educating ourselves to deal with it, because we're not always knowledgeable enough to deal with it. I'm gonna make an example that allows me to recognize some of the attendees in our lecture. We did this project that you're familiar with a number of scholars from UMass Boston, UMass Amherst, Lowell, and Dartmouth. We did a survey on coastal resilience in Massachusetts. We interviewed municipal officials, and one of the findings of this survey was that among the barriers reported by municipal officials in terms of not being able to implement or finding challenging to implement resilience strategies was lack of expertise at the local level to design the plans, to implement the plans. We have among our attendees members of the Massachusetts Municipal Association, which was one of our partners in the project, and we know that they work a lot on this front. And we realized the importance of building human capital, so building education, competence. And I wanted to acknowledge also another attendee, who's Trinh Nguyen, and she, I'm gonna read her title. She's a chief of the worker empowerment and the director of the Office of Workforce Development for the city of Boston. And this office received a very large grant for workforce development to tackle climate resilience. So when we think about financing, I can see like the complexity of the problem. And I was wondering, maybe it's a big question for closing remarks, but if you see success stories in terms of synergies for financing between private and public sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, and it's great to have, you know, that expertise on the call, and I wish we would have more time to actually also hear from you and hear where you see the biggest challenges. But in my mind, I mean, particularly at the moment, within communities, within cities, this is kind of tangible. You can feel it. It's kind of close by, at least the direct impact. And I think there are really good examples of where this has been framed, not just as, okay, we have to do something about flooding, but where this has been taken into, okay, well, let's revisit, you know, what is our vision for this neighborhood? You know, how are we going to make this more livable for, you know, for our children, for old people? And within that, you bring in climate resilience as a tool that will actually then enable you, or at least make sure that that vision is possible and does not get derailed by climate risk. And I think the moment you frame it, then it becomes also something positive, because I think this is the other thing. When I get up here, and I could have shown you like millions of pictures, of dramatic pictures of disasters and impacts and so on. Yeah. Yes, and I'm often, you know, struggling sort of to hide my despair, but there needs to be also like a positive story, and you need to motivate people, and you need to also acknowledge that, you know, that a lot of things can actually be done locally, and that people can take ownership. And I think, you know, that's where I see good potential. And then if businesses can support that or be involved in this Flood Resilience Alliance is one example. In London, we have the London Climate Change Partnership, where, I mean, you know, you can go through the list. Particular cities, I think, have been actually good breeding grounds for that kind of innovation. Yeah.
All right, I've got a bunch of questions about what you're saying, Marta. And I would say on the ground, you can have all the models you want and lots of chatter, but if it's not on the ground with the people to utilize it, I'm on my town's conservation action plan for that purpose.
Okay.
But I'm thinking of the people, I mean, to make that insurance, we have people in Salisbury, Newburyport that want the state to dump sand. As the person in Sunderland who's paying for this care about that. Like, why should I live in Sunderland. Why should I have the state dump sand that's going to be gone next nor'easter? And then we have people in Western Tennessee and Western North Carolina who live in the mountains and are getting flooded away for the first time because a giant high pushed the Helene the other way. How do you sell this to people like that? So you know what I'm saying is like, I mean, I'm scientist too, and I have a background on all that, but how do you get on the ground to convince these people that we have a governor, and the chancellor said, you know, the governors, the mayors, we have a governor in the Southeast Pacific got hammered by 2 major hurricanes that have had the text climate change removed from the school books. So I'm saying is like, how do we get, from all that to down to the level where it really needs it?
Okay,
Lots of stuff.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That was a lot, loaded question, sorry.
No, but I think ultimately it also comes down to, to sort of behavior. And I mean, I think it's also this expectation that somebody else is gonna do this for me. Our expectation that someone will protect me. I mean, a very small example, but I'm the only one in my neighborhood who, if there's really heavy rain, goes out in the middle of the night and clears the drains. I mean, it sounds pathetic. You say it is pathetic, but I don't want my basement to get wet and rain. And I know if there's leaves on the drain, it's not rocket science, and I just do it. I look crazy, but I do it. And this is in the middle of London, so don't expect people to pay attention for what's going on in their neighborhood. But it's like, I would feel, ridiculous as my basement gets flooded. But that's just a small example, I think. So.
Isn't it kind of twofold where it's people want to understand like, okay, well, if we do this one, what's the cost? And then like you said, bringing other people in, you have that whole mentality of, well, it's not affecting me, so why should I pay for it? Like people that aren't being directly affected, and I'm sure at some point they will, because it's gonna get to every location. But in the meantime, you have kind of that mentality, like, why should I pay for the sand on their dune when I don't live there? Like, why are my taxes? It has kind of that. What's the cost? I mean, we're seeing that in healthcare. We have all this new healthcare advances with technology, and yet the cost for people to actually afford it is out of control, and there's no coverage, and people are just going to be like, I can't do that. What can I do that's not going to cost me an arm and a leg to be a part of contributing to something good?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are surveys, and I don't know how widespread they were yet in the US. So obviously there are also regional differences. I think this idea of do we have a solidarity approach?
Yeah.
I think surprisingly, most surveys show that if you ask people, so the challenge with surveys, if somebody asks you, would you support people in need and would you be well? Of course you say yes. Well, but by and large, I think society, you see these things and people have been impacted, and you think, oh well, I'm really glad I'm not in this situation, and should I support them? Yes. I guess the challenge is, if this repeats again and again and again, we're going to exhaust the ability to actually pay for that. It's as simple as that. And then we also need to reflect, maybe we're coming to some point and told you so. Why were you so stupid?
We're already there.
One interesting stat, and you're probably very familiar with that. I think the fastest growing city in the US is in Arizona. Or New Mexico is one of the hottest places, which has a really bad trajectory in terms of overheating. It's the fastest growing city. So that's just, it's just, this is what I mean with risk creation. So do you stop now people moving there? Well, how?
They're already in Florida. They're done. They can't get insurance for their homes. Like it's a disaster. Well, it's been a disaster waiting to happen. It's just now become a natural disaster, and people are just like, we're done. I'm gone. They're leaving. So maybe it's kind of reflection.
Okay, well, we should start at a positive note.
So we are gonna thank you, Svenja, for your talk. It was great.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you, and I would like to thank all those who participated and also those who organized. particularly Carol, Rob, Darcy, wonderful
Melissa.
Melissa, who
So much,
saved us so
yeah.
much from logistics, and Nick
Tried.
for being part of our logistical cause. And with this, we're gonna say goodbye to our online participants, and I will send out announcements for future talks. So